Fair warnings, babes. This is an adult podcast made for adults. We dive into historical events that might make some of y'all blush or feel a bit uncomfortable over. So, if you are not an adult or an adult that prefers to steer clear of topics that get a little naughty, now might be the time to click away. For the rest of you darling souls, hello and welcome. Ready to pay for it? Me too. But before we dive in, if you love your history with a spicy twist, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your favorite troublemakers. It's the best way to keep this show going, and trust me, I love keeping you coming back for more. All right, enough foreplay. Let's head straight into the red light district. I'm ready, if you are.
I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come on. I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come on. I'm gonna turn back my mattress and let you all my springs. I want you to find me, daddy, till the bell do ring. Oh, daddy, I want you to shade and dry.
Hello, my name is Summer, and this is Paying For It. Thank you for being here for episode 48. Hello, my history babes. How the hell are you? I'm doing pretty okay. I spent some Valentine's Day doing some Valentine's fun. I have a little reading vlog on my other YouTube channel. If you're into that sort of thing, I'll have it linked down below. I did lots of reading, and I did a lot of romance reading, of course, because what else do you do for Valentine's Day but read some romances? I ate pizza, and I just celebrated with loved ones and friends. I also recently broke my foot, which caused a slight delay and uproot to our rhythm that we had going. But that is okay. It is okay. We will survive. It hurts like a motherfucker, but life will go on. I did break my foot. It got slammed in a door, so I wouldn't really say it was my fault. Is it ever your fault when you break your, I don't think anyone goes out intentionally to break foot, but or break anything really. But so I did break my foot, so I have it down here just resting, which will also be the reason for our drink that we have today, which we'll get to soon enough. But yes, it is a bummer. It happened a week ago yesterday. So luckily it is just a bit of a frontal foot fracture with a few toes broken as well. So it could have been worse, and we're glad it wasn't. But that is what I have been up to. Not much else, to be honest, but I've been now just really relaxing and hanging out and recovering. But I felt up to getting in front of the camera again and recording an episode because I am very excited about this one, and it's our first time back after concluding Lizzie Lape. So I was excited to get here and do this episode. And babes, I had a plan. A nice little palate cleanser before diving into our next historical lady. I was going to cover the American Plan. One of those historical laws that pops up again and again into our deep dives. You know, the kind of law that shaped the lives of our favorite scandalous ladies. In ways we need to understand, I feel, for this podcast to fully come together. And yeah, but here's the thing. Once I started my research, I realized this isn't just a side note. The American Plan is a full-blown, batshit insane deep dive waiting to happen. So, I've got a book on the way, and trust me, the episode is going to be worth the wait. The episodes are going to be worth the wait. Which left me, of course, in a bit of a pickle. There goes my short and sweet palate cleanser. Back to the drawing board. Luckily, I have a running list of episode ideas, and if you have any ladies, laws, or red light districts you'd love me to cover, drop a comment below. If it vibes with paying for it, I will add it to the list. And darlings, that brings us to today's topic, hog ranches. And no, I am not talking about the livestock. I've got a goodie, but a shorty for you today. A little piece of history that's sure to have us giggling and blushing, but not quite enough for a several episode deep dive. Let's get into it. So without further ado, you know what time it is. Grab yourself a cocktail, a mocktail, a coffee, whatever you fancy. Today, I have an interesting drink for us. I'm on pain meds, clearly. So I am not drinking that much. I'm not drinking. So I have a interesting soda mixture. Some of you guys may know of Swigs or even seen it on TikTok or YouTube, but it's a soda shop that does different crazy mixtures of sodas. And I went recently because I found one very close to where I live, and I was like, whoa, I didn't even know they had these here in Texas. And they do, apparently. They have at least one. And so I went because I was curious and I wanted to try it. And I got the Heartbreaker, which was Dr. Pepper, my fave, blackberry syrup, also I'm from Oregon, so love a blackberry, coconut syrup, and a little bit of half and half. And it was delicious. I had such a good time drinking it. I had a lot of fun. I was walking through the store a couple of days later, and I just happened to notice that Dr. Pepper came out with a new flavor, and it was blackberry. And I was like, that's interesting. So I grabbed it, and it's far sweeter than I expected it to be. And so I was like, oh, wow, that's very sweet. And then I thought, well, shoot, I should try cutting it with some half and half. So I did, and it's delicious, and that's what we have here. I have been on the hunt for coconut syrup. I went to like 3 different stores, cannot find it. But nonetheless, this is still very, very, very good. So I cannot have a drink, but if you're having a drink, I hope you're enjoying it. And if you're just drinking a coffee, I hope it's giving you all the caffeine you need today. And yeah, whatever else you are drinking, even if it's just water, gray babes, stay hydrated. We all need that. But cheers, 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 cheers. And let me take you to the Hog Ranches. To understand Hog Ranches and why they're a little historical gem in our kind of history, we have to set the scene. And babes, that means heading straight into one of my favorite periods in American history. The Wild, Wild West, baby. All right. We are going way back, all the way around to about 1860. And if there's one thing we've learned about the ladies who sold their wares, it's that business boomed during times of war. And guess what? The American West was practically a revolving door of conflicts. So let's go to the American frontier. Which brings us to the American Frontier Wars, also known as the Indian Wars or the American Indian Wars. It's a series of battles, skirmishes, and outright land grabs between Native American tribes and a whole cast of colonial powers, including the U.S., European empires, and even for a hot minute, the Confederate States and the Republic of Texas. These so-called conflicts technically started back in around 1609, but for our purposes, we are focusing on the American frontier between 1860 and 1890, because that's where the hog ranches made their marks. By this time, the American West was popping off with boomtowns, gold, silver, land opportunities. It was the ultimate dream for settlers looking for a fresh start or a fast fortune. But getting there, oh honey, that was no easy feat. Only the bravest or the most desperate made the journey. And they were met with nothing but danger along the way. We're talking extreme conditions, brutal terrain, and barely any resources. Running out of food or water wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean death. And let's not forget disease, because if diphtheria didn't get you, cholera just might. Then there was the whole issue of who you'd run into on the road. This was a time of absolute lawlessness, and boomtowns were attracting all kinds of people. Some friendly, of course. Some definitely not. Settlers had to worry about being ambushed, robbed, or worse. Social tensions were already simmering, and violence was a real threat before you even reached your destination. But if you did make it to the boomtown, congrats! Now you had a whole new set of problems to deal with. Boomtowns were built around gold and silver strikes, which meant they attracted miners, entrepreneurs, and business owners, hoping to cash in. But they also drew the outlaws, gamblers, and hustlers, who had zero interest in playing by the rules. There wasn't much in the way of law enforcement either, so bar fights, shootouts, and straight-up vigilant justice were part of daily life. And health hazards? Oh, they didn't get any better. Poor sanitation, new diseases, unexpected natural disasters. It was survival of the fittest, darlings. Like, it was a harsh life to live. And then there was the economy. Boomtowns were highly unstable. One day you're standing in the middle of a bustling, thriving town. The next, the gold dries up and it's a ghost town. If you were lucky, you saw it coming and got out. If not, you were left stranded, broke, and out of options. And let's not forget those social tensions. Didn't end when you reached town. In fact, they got worse. Boomtowns were melting pots of different ethnic groups. And that diversity, instead of leading to harmony, often led to racial discrimination and violent confrontations. It was a dangerous mix of opportunity, lawlessness, and unchecked tension. So while we love to romanticize the Wild Wild West, let's be real. It was intense, it was dangerous, and for lack of better word, a wild-ass time to be alive. Which brings us back to the American Frontier Wars, or the Indian Wars. The battles breaking out weren't just happening along the road to boomtowns, they were inside them too. Those conflicts were one of the biggest social tensions of the time, which led to the US government to push for military forts along major settlements, railroads, and supply routes. With Native American resistance, including conflicts like the Great Sioux War from 1876 to 77, and the Apache War, soldiers were stationed at these forts for long periods of time. But here's the thing. Despite what you might imagine, they weren't out fighting battles every single day. In fact, there were long stretches of absolute boredom between conflicts, and a bunch of restless soldiers stuck in one place far too long. Well, let's just say they started looking for entertainment. And that, my loves, is where the hog ranches come in. So what the fuck are hog ranches exactly? Well, darling, we wouldn't be talking about them if they weren't notorious. Now would we? Hog ranches were the wild watering holes of the American West in the late 19th century. Rowdy saloons, brothels, and gambling houses rolled into one, conveniently set up near military forts and frontier towns. These weren't just your average taverns, oh no. They catered specifically to soldiers, cowboys, and miners, and all manners of frontier men looking for the fixings: booze, gambling, entertainment, and of course, some short-term companionship. That is, as long as you had the money to pay for it. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Hog ranches were almost always set up just outside the jurisdiction of military bases and towns, keeping them safe from the long arm of the law, or what little law existed out there. That meant they could operate however they pleased, without military officers or town officials getting in the way of the fun. And let me tell you, these places were wild. We're talking drunken brawls, high-stake gambling, gunfights, and every kind of vice you can imagine. They were infamous for their rough and tumble nature, their lawlessness, and their anything-goes attitude. But as with anything in the Wild West, where there was money, danger wasn't far behind. Oh, and now we're getting to the really juicy part. Let's talk about some of the most infamous hog ranches, the military forts that cozied up to them, and the wild stories and even wild characters that frequented them. Now let's start with the hog ranches in Nebraska, just outside of Fort Robinson, one of the major U.S. Army forts during the Great Sioux Wars. Now, if you're not familiar with the Sioux Wars, it was a series of bloody conflicts between the U.S. government and various Sioux tribes, primarily in the latter half of the 19th century. And like so many conflicts in American history, the heart of the issue was land. Specifically, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. See, back in the day, there was treaties between the U.S. and the Sioux and protecting their land in the Great Plains. But when gold was found, those treaties, they basically got thrown out the window. Settlers started pouring in, tensions skyrocketed, of course, and things got real violent real fast. Some of the most notorious battles of this era included the Gretton Massacre in 1854, the fight that started it all over what, you may ask? a stolen cow. Yes, really. The clash led to the deaths of numerous U.S. soldiers and sparked massive public outcry. To this day, the exact details of what went down remain very, very murky. Another battle was the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, a huge victory for the Sioux and their allies, where they took down none other than George Custer and his cavalry. And then another battle was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, a tragic and brutal event where the U.S. soldiers slaughtered unarmed Sioux during the Ghost Dance movement. Now, what does all this have to do with hog ranches? Well, Fort Robinson was a key military stronghold during these conflicts, meaning it was packed with soldiers who, when they weren't fighting, were drinking. Enter the hog ranches. These rough and rowdy establishments set up shop right outside the fort, offering all the liquor, gambling, and company a weary soldier could ask for. And let me tell you, the men stationed at Fort Robinson took full advantage. We know about these Nebraska hog ranches because soldiers from the fort were frequently getting arrested after particularly wild nights at the ranches. And if that weren't enough, Fort Robinson is also infamous as the place where Crazy Horse, the legendary Lakota leader, was killed in 1877. So between the bloodshed of the Great Sioux Wars, the infamous death of Crazy Horse, and an army full of soldiers stumbling back from hog ranches, Fort Robinson earned itself quite a reputation. And we're just getting started, babes, because there are plenty more hog ranches making history in the Wild West. Hog ranches in Arizona, Apache Territory, and Outlaw Haven. Now, if you thought Nebraska hog ranches were rowdy, just wait until you get to Arizona, where the saloons weren't just filled with lonely soldiers, but also gamblers and outlaws, and some of the deadliest gunfights in history. These hog ranches popped up near Fort Bowie and Fort Huachuca. I know I'm saying that wrong, and I'm sorry. Two major military strongholds during the Apache Wars. If you're not familiar, these wars were a long and brutal conflict between the U.S. Army and Apache resistance. Fighters most famously led by Geronimo. And if you've learned anything from this show, you know that wherever there was soldiers, there was hog ranches ready to keep them entertained. But here's the twist. They weren't just soldier saloons. These hog ranches were full-fledged outlaw havens, attracting some of the most notorious figures of the Wild West. You never knew if you'd be sitting next to a drunk cavalryman, a high-stakes gambler, or a wanted fugitive. And speaking of outlaws, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were known to pass through these very hog ranches on their way to Tombstone. Yes, that Tombstone. The one where they famously faced off in the gunfight at the OK Carroll. Now, if you want the full in-depth, sassy as hell breakdown of the legendary shootout and the woman who stood up by her man, no matter what, go check out episode number 7, Big Nose Kate, because trust me, she was a force to be reckoned with, and also one of my favorite episodes. But back to the hog ranches. These places weren't just about booze and brothels. They were the backdrop for some of the Wild West most dangerous and thrilling stories. And with the constant mix of soldiers, outlaws, and drifters, violence was always just a hair trigger away. And babes, we still are not done because there are more hog ranches to uncover. So saddle up because this ride is only getting wilder. Mining Town Mayhem, the hog ranches of Montana. Now, we've talked about soldiers and outlaws, but let's not forget another huge part of the Wild West, the gold miners. And trust me, babes, the hog ranches near the mining towns of Virginia City, Montana, and Helena, Montana, were some of the wildest of them all. Those gold miners, man, they were rough and rowdy. These hog ranches weren't just catering to the soldiers. Oh no, they were packed with the miners fresh off the gold fields, pockets overflowing with newly struck fortune, and zero sense of self-preservation. And with every boomtown, you already know what came next. Rowdy gambling halls, saloons doubling as brothels, and a whole lot of trouble. Virginia City and Helena were infamous for their outlaws and criminals, with hog ranches serving as both entertainment hubs and hideouts for the most wanted men in the territory. The towns were so lawless that at one point, Virginia City was practically run by an outlaw gang. But that didn't last long, as one day a young miner was found murdered, and that was the final straw. The townsfolk had it, so they did what any good frontier settlement did in the absence of real law enforcement. They formed a posse. And babes, this was not your average posse. This group became known as the Montana Vigilantes. Don't know why I struggle with that word so hard, but I really do. And they took justice into their own hands. These vigilantes raided multiple hog ranches in Montana, rounding up criminals hiding inside, and let's just say they didn't waste much time with trials. Nope, they went straight to the hanging of it all, putting an end to some of the town's most notorious outlaws. In fact, some of the men that they found, they didn't even waste any time. They would hang them right outside of the hog ranches, practically on the front porch of the hog ranches. Now, if you're wondering about the ladies who ran these circles, let me introduce you to Julia Ballette, a lady of the evening who made a name for herself in the rough and tumble world of mining, boomtowns. If you want to hear her wild and tragic story, make sure to check out episode number 19 of Paying for It. Trust me, babes, it is one that you do not want to miss. So while these Montana hog ranches might have started as rowdy dens of drinking and debauchery, they quickly became part of the much bloodier chapter of the Wild West. And babes, we still have much more hog ranches to uncover, so don't hang up your spurs just yet. There's plenty more history to get onto. The hog ranches of Deadwood, South Dakota. Gold, guns, and infamy. Now, babes, if you know anything about the Wild West, you know that Deadwood was a place where things got rowdy fast. This notorious gold rush boomtown in the Black Hills was practically built on a foundation of saloons, brothels, and bad decisions. If you want a deep dive into the ladies who worked Deadwood's red light district and the fights that broke out over them, I highly suggest you going back and listening to episode 20 through 23 of Paying for It. Trust me, it is a very wild ride. And we go deeper into the ladies. Now, let's get back to those hog ranches. Some of the saloons located a little outside of Deadwood were straight up hog ranches, serving up all-in-one experience for the soldiers passing through and the gold miners with fresh pay burning holes in their pockets. And by all-in-one, I do mean booze, gambling, and companionship for price, of course. But it wasn't just soldiers and miners frequenting these spots. Oh no, the hog ranches in Deadwood had some of the most infamous names of the Wild West rolling through. We're talking legendary outlaws like Jesse James and even lawmen like Seth Bullock. You never really knew if you'd be sharing a drink with a gunslinger or the men sent to hunt him down. And darlings, we cannot talk about Deadwood without talking about one of the wildest stories to ever come out of a saloon hog ranch. In 1876, inside Nuttall and Mann's saloon, a gambler by the name of Wild Bill Hickok sat down for a friendly game of poker. What he didn't realize was that his back was to the door. Apparently, a huge mistake in a town full of enemies. Before he could even react, a lowlife named Jack McCall walked in, pulled out a gun, and shot Wild Bill in the back of the head, killing him dead right there. And just like that, one of the most famous gunslingers of the Wild West was dead, still holding what would become known as the dead man's hand, which is aces and eights. So yeah, Deadwood's Hog Ranch weren't just places for whiskey and women. They were ground zero for some of the biggest names and deadliest showdowns in frontier history. And we still have more hog ranches to explore, so hold on to your hats. We're not done yet. Dodge City, Kansas, the wildest town in the West. All right, babes, buckle up because we are heading straight into Dodge City, one of the most lawless and downright dangerous towns of the Wild West. This place wasn't just rowdy, it was absolute chaos in the best and worst ways. Saloons? Everywhere. Brothels? Oh, you bet. Gambling houses? Honey, it was a gambler's paradise. And the clientele? Let's just say it was full of the kind of bad boys your mother warned you about, and a few that she probably should have. Now, Dodge City was built on cattle, cowboy, and conflict. The town saloons functioned just like hog ranches, serving up a deadly mix of whiskey, poker, and short-term companionship for both the cowboys riding in from the Chisholm Trail and the soldiers stationed at nearby Fort Dodge. And the company in these hog ranches absolutely legendary. This was stomping ground for some of the biggest names in the Wild West, including Wyatt Earp. Before his OK Carol fame, he was attempting to enforce the law here. That Matterson, another gunslinging lawman who was just as comfortable dealing cards as he was dealing justice. Doc Holliday, a man who could shoot and gamble in equal measures. And countless cattle drivers just looking to blow off some steam along a dirty, dusty ride. Now, let's talk about one of the most infamous hog ranch moments in Dodge City history. One night, Doc Holliday was playing poker in a hog ranch saloon, and a dispute broke out. Now, we know Doc had a big temper and a talent for guns, and this poor unlucky soul learned that the hard way. The argument was, of course, over poker, and it had escalated quickly, and before you could even say call or raise, Doc pulled out his gun and shot the man dead. And what happened after? Well, this was Dodge City, babes. So Doc was arrested, but somehow managed to walk away with his life, his reputation, and a whole lot of stories to tell. And there he went, a free man. So when history tells you that Dodge City was the wildest town in the West, believe it. The hog ranches weren't just about pleasure, they were about power, poker, and pistol smoke. And we still have more hog ranches to cover, so don't put your boots away just yet. Giddy up, let's head to the hog ranches near Fort Hays, Kansas. All right, babes, saddle up because we are making our way over to Fort Hays, Kansas, where the hog ranches walked so the ones in Dodge Cities could run. Fort Hays was established in 1865, and its main job was protecting settlers and wagon trains as they pushed westward. But let's be real. Anytime you have a military fort, Rory soldiers, and a town on the edge of lawlessness, you just know a hog ranch is setting up shop nearby. And honey, these early Kansas hog ranches Ranches were the blueprint for what would later make Dodge City the wildest place in the West. Now, let's talk about one of the most legendary figures to haunt these parts, and that would be Wild Bill Hickok. Before he was a full-blown Western icon, Wild Bill was working as a scout in Kansas, and let's just say he had a knack for finding trouble. One fateful night, Hickok found himself in a heated poker game at a nearby saloon, and babes, you already know where this is going. A disagreement seems to always turn into a standoff, and before you could say ante up, guns were drawn, and when the dust settled, Wild Bill walked away the winner. Not just in poker, but in staying alive. These early hog ranches may not have been as famous as their Dodge City descendants, but they sure knew how to bring the drama, the danger, and the debauchery. And with men like Wild Bill roaming the saloons, you know the nights here were anything but quiet. Now let's keep this trail moving. We have much more hog ranch mischief to uncover. Now, we are talking the hog ranches that made actual history. All right, babes, now we're getting into the real legends, the ones that stamped their names in history and got me started on this whole wild journey of learning about hog ranches in the first place. The next three aren't just your run-of-the-mill, nameless saloons tucked away in the shadows of military forts. Oh no, darlings, these hog ranches were notorious. They were big, bold, and rowdy as hell, leaving behind stories that deserve to be remembered. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into some real deal named hog ranches that set the standard for lawlessness, rivalry, and scandal in the Wild West. 10 Mile Hog Ranch, where the Wild West got wilder. Now we're heading over to Wyoming, home to one of the largest and rowdiest hog ranches in the American West. 10 Mile Hog Ranch near Fort Loramine. Now, if you're wondering where the name comes from, history tells us that hog ranches were often named by the distance from the nearest military base. And at a nice round 10 miles from Fort Loramine, this one lived up to its reputation as an absolute hotbed of debauchery. This wasn't some dingy shack on the outskirts of town. No, honey, 10 Mile Hog Ranch was a full-blown operation. We're talking multiple buildings, dance halls, brothels, saloons, the whole damn package. It catered to Fort Loramine soldiers, passing cowboys, and any other weary traveler looking for a little relaxation. And of course, like most hog ranches, it started to decline once Fort Loramine was abandoned, but not before leaving us with one of my favorite Wild West stories. One last drink for the road and the horse. Picture this. A cavalry officer, clearly several drinks deep, rides his horse straight through the saloon doors. And instead of, realizing that might not be the best life decision, he demands one last drink for himself and his trusty steed before galloping off into the night. And honestly, that might be the most cowboy thing I've ever heard. 10 Mile Hog Ranch might be a long gone, but its legend lives on. And babes, this is just one of many places where soldiers, cowboys, and outlaws blew off steam, lost their money, and maybe even left with a few bullet holes. So let's keep this party going, because there's more where that came from. One of the rowdiest of them all, 5 Mile Hog Ranch, Fort McKinney, Wyoming. If there was a Wild West version of Vegas, 5 Mile Hog Ranch would be it. Located, you guessed it, 5 miles from Fort McKinney, near Buffalo, Wyoming. This place had a reputation from being one of the rowdiest hog ranches on the frontier. Fort McKinney was established in 1877, right after the Great Sioux Wars, and like all good military forts, it had a steady stream of soldiers looking for trouble and a whole lot of pent-up energy. But the thing about 5 Mile, it wasn't just catering to lonely troops. It also started attracting outlaws, drifters, and Cattletown troublemakers, making it a hotbed of vice and lawlessness. This hog ranch, of course, had it all. a notorious saloon, a rowdy gambling den, and brothels, with plenty of willing and probably very exhausted women. And of course, when you throw that much whiskey, money, and testosterone into a place, shit was bound to hit the fan. One of the wildest stories to come out of 5 Mile was a full-on drunken shootout between cowboys and soldiers, leaving several people injured and even more dead. What the fight was over, history will never tell us, but if you think the officers at Fort McKinney were thrilled about their men causing chaos at 5 Mile, oh, honey, think again. They hated this place. The fort's officers were constantly threatening to burn it to the ground because it made keeping their soldiers in line damn near impossible. But 5 Mile Hog Ranch wasn't going down that easy. It survived all of their threats and remained standing until the fort itself was shut down. Talk about outliving your enemies, huh? The most famous of them all, 3 Mile Hog Ranch, Fort Lomain, Wyoming. Now, if we're talking about the most infamous hog ranch in the Wild West, it's got to be the 3 Mile Hog Ranch near Fort Lomain, Wyoming. This place wasn't just a backwater drive, it was a full-blown institution of debauchery. Located near one of the most important military posts on the Oregon Trail, 3 Mile was open for business from 1860 to the 1880s. And honey, it's all. Soldiers, traders, travelers. If you were brave or drunk enough to stumble through these swinging doors, 3 Mile was ready to serve you. This wasn't some hole-in-the-wall joint either. 3 Mile had high-stake gambling tables, flowing whiskey, a large brothel that always kept at least 10 working women on hand at all times. And the clientele? Only the most legendary names of the Wild West, of course. It's believed that Buffalo Bill, Cody, and Wild Bill Hickok were regulars coming through for their fair share of booze, bets, and beauties. The wild stories of 3 Mile Hog Ranch. With a reputation like that, you know the stories are so good. Soldiers sneaking out for a good time. Soldiers stationed at Fort Lomain were constantly sneaking out at night to visit the ranch, leading to officers chasing drunken men back to the fort more often than they probably would like to admit. And of course, a drunken cavalry dispute gone wrong. One of the wildest incidents, a group of rowdy cavalrymen got into a heated argument with the owner, probably over booze, women, or both, and set the whole damn place on fire in a drunken rage. Luckily, the fire was put out before history recorded any casualties. But still, that kind of gives you the idea of what life was in the West. People just did not care. And also, even if they did care, they had enough liquor in their systems not to care then. And then there, of course, is the Calamity Jane connection. It's said that before she became a famous sharpshooter and Wild West legend, Martha Calamity Jane Cannery actually worked within the 3 Mile brothel. And knowing what we know about Calamity, she probably did more than just work. She probably drank, fought, and raised hell just like the men. And that brings us to the end of an era. Like most hog ranches, 3 Mile's days were numbered. After the Indian Wars ended in 1890, Fort Lomain was abandoned, and with soldiers gone, business dried up. No troops, no travelers, no more need for 3 Miles services. But while the whiskey stopped flowing and the doors eventually closed, 3 Mile Hog Ranch left its mark on history. In fact, today it's officially listed on the National Register of Historical Places because even the US government had to admit that this place was legendary. Now, let's talk about the woman of the Hog Ranch. Ranches: Survival, Grit, and the Wild West Realities. Now, let's talk about the real backbone of the Hog Ranches: the woman. While history tends to focus on the gunfighters, soldiers, and outlaws, the truth is these places wouldn't have been what they were without the sex workers, madams, and entertainers who kept things running. A hard life in a hard place. Life at Hog Ranches wasn't all whiskey, dancing, and easy money. It was rough, dangerous, and often very deadly. Violence was a daily risk. Drunken soldiers and cowboys weren't exactly known for their gentlemanly behavior. And with fights breaking out constantly, women were often caught in the chaos, or worse, targeted. Disease, of course, was very rampant. Syphilis, tuberculosis, and other illnesses tore through the West, and for sex workers, access to medical care was nearly non-existent. Many women would die young simply because their line of work put them right in the path of infection and poor living conditions. And like always, there was no real protection. The law was already very shaky in the frontier, but for women in the hog ranches, forget about it. If they were beaten, robbed, or worse, there was no real justice system looking out for them. The men around them, be they soldiers, gamblers, or outlaws, were usually more powerful, and that meant survival depended on wit, alliances, and sometimes just sheer luck. Revenge, survival, and bribery. Now, that doesn't mean the women just sat back and took it. Some of these ladies fought back hard. There are plenty of stories of women defending themselves, getting revenge on abusive clients, or even running the whole damn business themselves. Madams knew how to play the game. The army and local law enforcement constantly tried to shut down hog ranches, but a smart madam with a little extra cash could usually pay off the right people to keep the doors open. Of course, some women found ways out if they were lucky or smart with their money. Some women saved up, became madams, or ran businesses of their own. Others found wealthy men to marry and left the hog ranch life behind entirely. Others weren't so lucky. Many women, just like the men they served, died young, went missing, or simply faded into history. The West was brutal, and for every woman who made it out, there were plenty more who didn't. And the same thing could be said about the men. Plenty of men made their names for themselves as gamblers and gunslingers and outlaws, but there are plenty of men who faded off into history, died young, or just disappeared. The reality of hog ranch women, at the end of the day, the women of the hog ranches were survivors. They lived alongside some of the roughest men in history, facing the same dangers, the same lawlessness, and often even worse odds. And while their names may not always be remembered, their stories, the fights, the survival, and the sheer grit are part of what made the Wild West so damn wild. The legacy of hog ranches in the Wild West. Hog ranches were the ultimate embodiment of the frontier. Lawlessness, a mix of debauchery, survival, and optimism that fueled the Wild West, most infamous legends. These weren't just rowdy saloons with a few beds in the back. They were makeshift towns of vice, catering to the soldiers, cowboys, miners, and outlaws who roamed a world still being carved out of the wilderness. At their core, hog ranches served a necessary function, whether society liked it or not. They provided soldiers and frontiermen with a place to drink, gamble, and find companionship, filling a void in the isolated outpost of the West. They existed because there was a demand, and as long as men had money to spend, someone was going to be there to take it. And while, of course, they were magnets for outlaws, gamblers, and drifters, some of the West's biggest names found their way through their doors. Wild Bill Hickok, Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, even men considered the law still had their moments in these dens of vice. Some came for pleasure, some for profit, and some, as history tells us, didn't leave alive. But the real unsung figures of the hog ranches were the women who worked inside them. Their lives were brutal, but they were also the backbone of these operations, keeping the whiskey flowing, the cards flipping, and the business running. Sometimes in spite of the men around them. Some, of course, found ways out if that's what they wanted. Some built their own empires. And some, like the men that they served, were swallowed whole by the dangers of the frontier. Like the forts they once thrived near, hog ranches faded into history, casualties of the changing world. As settlements grew into real towns, laws tightened, and military outposts shut down. There was less room for unchecked debauchery, but for a time, these places stood a testament to the untamed nature of the American Wild West, a world where rules were scarce, whiskey was plenty, and survival depended on just how well you played the game. And if history tells us anything, it's that the hog ranches may be gone, but their stories that they left behind, those will never die. Well, that's a wrap on this wild ride through the hog ranches of the West. If you loved this episode and want more scandalous history, be sure to visit payingforitmedia.com. Sign up for the newsletter so you never miss an update, a deep dive, or some extra juicy tidbits. And hey, if you're enjoying Paying for It, take a moment to follow and leave a review. It helps more history lovers and curious minds find us. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another story you won't want to miss. Until then, keep it sassy, keep it scandalous, and as always, keep paying for it. Goodbye.
I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh.